Gloria Steinem, you are an undisputable figure of the feminist struggle, and in particular of the struggle for women's rights in the United States. Your unwavering commitment to abortion rights deserves our admiration. You continue to work tirelessly for the preservation of this fundamental right for women to have free access to their bodies. I can only imagine your shock when you learned of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision, the landmark piece of legislation that made access to an abortion a federal right in the United States. The consequences of this decision are not only disastrous for American women, but also have important repercussions for the entire world. It sends a dangerous signal that reinforces the supporters of the anti-abortion movements and reflects, once again, how women's rights are never won and remain fragile. We are in a logic of backlash. While issues related to the defense of women's rights, and in particular the fight against sexist and sexual violence, benefit from an important media coverage, this setback is very worrying. It is all the more worrying that this decline is not only observed in authoritarian regimes, but it is worldwide. The new United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, has recently shown himself to be very worried about this situation. He denounced the rise of misogynistic attitudes that affect women and girls in many parts of the world in an unprecedented way. Some observation from Amnesty International, 25 years after the adoption of an historic agreement on gender equality at the Fourth World Conference of Women in Beijing, very hostile reactions threaten today to deprive women and girls of their rights. In Europe, we have also seen the withdrawal of several member states from the Istanbul Convention for a number of years: Hungary, Bulgaria, Slovakia. Yet, this is one of the most productive texts in the fight against sexist and sexual violence. Everywhere, conservatives are united around value linked to a patriarchal vision of society. They are united around a gendered conception of the family, but also around their desire to control women's body and prevent their emancipation. Even in Switzerland, where the right to abortion has been acquired since 2002, treats loom. In December 2021, the populist political party UDC launched two popular initiatives aimed at restricting the use of abortion. Fortunately, the Swiss population has until now always refused proposals to restrict the right to abortion. Women's bodies are still and always will be a field of infinite battles. As Simone de Beauvoir said in 1949, all it takes is a political, economic, or religious crisis for women's rights to be called into question. These rights can never be taken for granted. You must remain vigilant throughout your lives. These words are still relevant today. Each generation of feminists brings a new dimension and additional claims related to the issues of their time. However, it is important to build on the achievements of previous generations and to draw on this common history. Gloria Steinem, you are a model for the young feminists of today who can undoubtedly be nourished and inspired by your struggles. You have always denounced the control of the bodies of women and gender minorities as an early symptom of authoritarianism. If each person does not have the power to decide about their own body, men and women, we do not live in a democracy. To defend reproductive justice is also to defend democracy. No society can thrive by excluding half of its population. Women's rights are not reversible. The fight for equality is not over. Your commitment is exceptional, Gloria. Continue to fight with the same favor and inspire us. In closing, I would like to highlight the remarkable work of the Créatives, which we have been supporting for the past 5 years through the Office for Gender Equality, BPEV. I wish you a very good festival and thank you very much for your attention.
Before we let the feminist magic happen with this fabulous conversation that we are more than delighted to offer you today, let me perhaps introduce our guests. Célia Héron, our moderator, is the head of the society section of the newspaper Le Temps, whose writing has been awarded several prizes and who has had the chance to nourish her feminist reflection in non-European environments and settings. She'll give the floor to Gloria Steinem, whose achievements and commitments I cannot honor in just a few seconds. An icon of feminism and bearer of deeply intersectional values, a journalist and activist who's dedicated her life to the cause of women and gender minorities from all ethnicities and social backgrounds. A luminous and courageous figure, inspiring across borders and generations. It's an honor to welcome her today. Gloria, thank you so much for being here and waking up early for us today. It's an honor to be standing in front of you. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to all the messages you're going to share with us today. Celia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marius. Thank you to Les Créatives. It's an honor for me too, of course. Hello, Gloria. So apparently the floor is ours. Thank you for waking up at the crack of dawn indeed. I hope you have a good cup of coffee. You are a reporter, a writer, an activist. You gave speeches everywhere, almost. Barack and Michelle Obama are huge fans of yours. I mean, who can say that? We are so grateful to be talking to you today. And since you have canceled your European tour due to health issues and back pain, let me start with a very simple question. Can you hear me?
I heard question, but not the question.
That's the most important word. No, my question was, how are you and how is your health?
I'm fine. I'm sitting down, which is the main requirement of my back problem, and I'm enjoying the miracle of transcontinental feminist revolution that you have going here. So thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. So let's dive in. We just found out over the weekend that the US Senate will stay in Democratic hands, and I was just curious, did you celebrate? Was it a half defeat or a half victory to you?
No, it was an important victory because in this country we've been dealing with a man named Trump who is more of a danger than the usual Republican opposition. So this Democratic victory meant much more.
Of course. So the debates on abortion seem to have weighed on the public opinion and the vote. So did the feminist issues that have been raised 5 years after Me Too. And since you are sometimes called a rock star of feminism, even mother of feminism, let's dive into your background and try to understand where you come from, if I may, before we switch to politics and to social change. So my first question would be, in your memoir, My Life on the Road, you explain how your childhood on the road with your family prepared you somehow for the rest of your life as an organizer. So when would you say you became a feminist, and was there ever a tipping point that made you focus on that specific issue and topic?
I think as a child, I didn't know what a feminist was, but I was reading an author here, perhaps internationally, named Louisa May Alcott, who was a feminist in her day, and who wrote almost exclusively about women. So I think as a child, I just assumed it. I didn't understand the opposition until later. I assumed I would have to give in to the opposition, that I would have to lead a conventional life. But fortunately, two things happened. One was that I lived in India for 2 years, where the revolution included women. And the other was that a women's movement happened in this country. So I have always been lucky to have a community.
I was wondering if the fact that you were not put through the traditional school system may have maybe changed your way of looking at the world, or maybe made you think out of these traditional gender boxes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, perhaps, because education, especially then, did create gender boxes, and I was blissfully less aware of them, perhaps. However, the 1950s, which you are too young to have experienced as a very conservative time, did put us in those boxes and made me assume that I would have to live in that way. So it was very important to have a revolutionary time approaching the 60s and the 70s. And also, as I was saying, to live in India, in which this was very much part of the social change.
Mm. We'll come back to the social change very quickly. About your childhood and family, I was also wondering, so your memoir is in many ways a love letter, very compassionate at times to your parents. To which extent did your parents influence your life, whether it being following some sort of lead or building your path against something that they represented?
My mother had been a journalist before I was born and had I'm sorry, it's a tragedy that she was deprived of her occupation, but it was still present. She taught me how to fold a paper into thirds so I could hold it in my hand like a reporter. And so she valued books, she valued poetry. Her formative contribution was huge, obviously. I probably don't know its depth myself. My father contributed something else in a way, because one, he didn't oppose this equality, and two, he had 2 points of pride. He never wore a hat, which in his generation men were supposed to do, and he never had a job. By that he meant he never worked for anybody else. So he had a summer resort in the summer. He sold antiques in the winter, but he was his own boss. So I suppose in a big subliminal way, this influenced me because it made me understand that it was possible to live in that way. One did not have to have a 9-to-5 job, which existed in the social order, and imposed a certain social order.
It's a very free way of looking at the world to decide that you can be your own boss and do your own thing, follow your own path. Now another personal question, but many podcasts, books, and articles have recently highlighted the difficulty of heterosexual love among feminists. And I was wondering if during your life, if you were ever able to build an equal relationship with a romantic partner.
Yes, I mean, although we were assumed to be lesbians, especially because I was speaking with a woman partner, actually we were not lesbians, though my partner, Florence Kennedy, had a wonderful way of kind of just not telling people, since it was none of their business. When some man would get up in the audience and say to the two of us speaking together, "Are you lesbians?" She would only say, "Are you my alternative?" which made the audience laugh and didn't tell them anything. But the women's movement does and should make room for all kinds of individual lifestyles. And so it made room for us too.
Very well. You were one of the first public figures to openly talk about your own abortion. Your book is dedicated to the doctor who helped you in this difficult time. Do you mind telling us a little bit about that and how and when you chose to share this story?
I owe my sharing of this story to the fact that other women did. I had not talked about it openly until I came back from India and London, where I actually had the abortion, and was a journalist for a magazine here, covering a women's movement or an early meeting of the women's movement that was a speak out about abortion. I suddenly realized that if then, as now, something like 1 in 3 or 1 in 5, we're not, anyway, a great number of women have needed to have an abortion in their lifetime. Why was it illegal and why was it secret? So I owe my ability to talk about it to the fact that other women did. And I think this is the contagion of a movement. When one person tells the truth, it allows others to do the same.
Do you remember the reaction when you did? Is there some feedback that has really meant something huge to you?
Well, it was a period of speaking out. So for one thing, I was not alone. And I discovered by writing about it how unalone I really was, because it enabled other people, other women, to speak about it. And at that time, because there were few places here that one could write about the women's movement, I had begun to go out and speak together with my partner, Florence Kennedy, and others. And so people in the audience would stand up and say what their experience had been. It was then still an illegal and often unsafe procedure in this country. And it's still not always easy in every state. In some states, women have to leave to find this simple health service. But it just the simple right, as you said in your introduction, to make decisions about your own bodies was an assumption that patriarchy had taken away. I mean, it's the very definition of patriarchy. Mm-hmm. So it was an important symbol of striving for a feminist democracy.
And feminism and democracy is definitely linked. Everything is political, but if we now think of feminism on a more systemic level, is the debate about abortion in the US part of the current recent backlash, according to you, or is it some bigger, deeper, maybe political shift? How do you analyze it?
It is part of the political backlash because we have varying ability to get abortion depending on the state that we live in. So it was not a big issue, say, in New York and California, where that right is assumed, but in other states it was. And also the issue of women leaving the state in order to get an abortion. So it remains fundamental, doesn't it, that women's need to control our own bodies is also one that, for a variety of reasons, including racism here, as well as sexism, is sometimes opposed.
It sounds like a $1 billion question, but I'm often asked this and I'm not always sure how to answer it. So here I go. What would you say is at the root of sexism? And to which extent is it linked to reproductive rights?
I do think that it's rooted in patriarchy and also racism, since one has to control who marries whom in order to perpetuate racism, or who has children with whom. So it is very, very basic to democracy, to our individual right to control our own lives. It is rooted in the body. It is rooted in the political system. It is basic in every way.
About abortion, you actually wrote also that the #1 cause of global warming was forcing women to have children they didn't want. Can you explain to us why?
Well, I was speaking of the longest term cause, which is overpopulation. Obviously there are more immediate causes in terms of fossil fuel and the particular causes of global warming itself, but the biggest long-term cause is overpopulation.
Yeah, there is one sentence in your book that I find really fascinating, highlighting the fact that we do not really think about this issue. You wrote, each economics course should start with reproduction, not just production. And that made so much sense.
Yes, it makes sense to me, right? But the field of economics as a scholarly intellectual endeavor was not mainly invented by female human beings. So it did indeed start with, classically anyway, with production.
So on a side note, I just want to share with you and the public an anecdote leading to a question, but this is a true story. So a man I know, good-natured friend of mine, was telling me recently about his wife being pregnant. And they both went to an obstetrician's appointment for an ecography to find out if it was a boy or a girl, because it was important to them. And thinking he was funny, he told the doctor, "So, is it a boy or is it an abortion?" He did not understand why I didn't laugh. Obviously, I was appalled. And when I told him that baby girls were still killed because they were girls, he did not believe me. And my question to you is, how do we highlight this continuum of gender violence across history, across the globe, and across social classes, so that it becomes some sort of enlightenment or a desirable outcome to understand why something needs to change?
No, well, that's an unforgettable story that you just told. And the use of abortion in order to produce more male children is something that has been a fact of life in some parts of India that I know of, and I'm sure others too. It makes no sense. I mean, human beings are human beings, each one unique and individual, regardless of whether the world labels that person or that group by race or ethnicity or gender. So it is a kind of holocaust of females to say otherwise.
But do you feel like the contemporary debates linked to feminism are only including some sort of intellectual elite, or how do we make all these points across the different social backgrounds and social classes so that we can also include all different parts of society?
I'm sure it happens in a slightly different way in different cultures in different countries. Here, it was very much not part of the intellectual elite. It was the opposite, because while that was still in a very patriarchal form, there were women, especially Black women, African-American women in this country, like Fannie Lou Hamer, a great civil rights figure, who were standing up for women, for reproductive rights, before many white women were. So here, and also because the civil rights movement preceded what we think of as the women's movement, Black women were the leaders. Even in public opinion polls, Black women were more likely to support feminism and issues of equality and in general than white women were in the beginning, in the 1960s and 70s.
I wonder why that has changed or seemed to have changed, as in sometimes it feels like the contemporary debates are not that including. Not that, it's all happening in our ivory towers, but it seems to me like 50 years ago the grassroots movement was more like a tree, coming from the roots and blossoming. And it feels sometimes like here it's again, I come back to this elite notion, but I wonder how disconnected we sometimes sound like, we feminists, to people who have other preoccupations. I wonder how this shift may have happened. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, yes, I do. Perhaps because of our, in this country, college campuses, where there came to be women's studies, Black studies, areas of academic concentration. It came to seem that way, though it had begun in a very different way, having to do with reproduction, with the workforce, with health, with everyday issues. Alice Walker, our great author here, used to say womanism, for instance, because she felt that feminism was not as well understood as a word, and womanist as opposed to feminist. So yes, I think you're right. It's not true in reality or of necessity, but it came to be true because of the role that campuses played.
I wonder also if it came to be true due to the way organizers have organized. Very basically, I mean, if you are on the field talking to people, maybe you seem like or sound like someone who is more approachable, whereas if the organizers work online or on conferences, this disconnect may appear bigger than it actually is in just the tools and the way that people organize.
Yeah, no, I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. It had a little hiccup, the sound system there. I didn't let you finish.
No, I was finished.
I think you're right, because just by the most populist, you might say, measure that I have, which is the years of going around speaking with my speaking partners, each of whom was an African-American woman, we could see that the interest was equal or more so on the part of African-American, Hispanic, and other women. But on campus, it may have seemed otherwise. However, in public opinion polls from the beginning, it was often the case that African American women were more likely than white women to respond to these issues, because for one thing, white women were more likely to be supported by their husbands or be able to be supported by their husbands. So the issues of equality in the workforce were not as real or as or didn't happen as early, perhaps, to many.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing that really changed also the perception of the movement is obviously the Me Too movement. And I would love for us to discuss just what happened over the past 5 years. The world is a totally different place from what it was even just 5 years ago with regards to feminism. And according to you, what did change and what did not change at all?
Well, it's still fundamental, isn't it? I mean, we're just trying to say that human beings, each human being is a unique miracle, and that is true regardless of whether there is melanin in our skin or, other things that are divisive in everyday life. That's, that's the message and the reality. But because women in the workforce, especially in the lower rungs of the labor force, were more likely to be exploited, because women who couldn't get work and were not educated were more likely to have to resort, say, to prostitution. There came to be differences among what you might regard as classes of women. I hope and believe that the movement itself is more likely to reflect geography. That is, the movement started with women sitting around their kitchen tables, or, meeting in whatever way they could in their factories or in their offices. So it was less about class than geography.
What particularly struck you over the past 5 years? Is there one, if you could take one thing away from this whole Me Too movement, is there one thing that you would really want to highlight?
Well, it's all about women's bodies, whether it's reproduction or sex, and whether that sex is chosen by women or chosen by men. It is a politics that's very much rooted in the body. Because I haven't been in the conventional labor force usually myself, as a writer and as someone working in the movement, I was somewhat surprised and dismayed to see that the Me Too movement was still necessary, that in the workforce, women's bodies were still not necessarily regarded as their own, and they were still targets. So the Me Too movement was and is very, very, very important.
This whole conversation about consent also in the same line was still is very necessary and fascinating to me that we still have to explain. But yeah, this has been crucial also in the way the media has chosen to write about it, to give some sort of bigger echo to something that has been said for decades. So basically, I was just curious, what did you think of the way the media, and obviously I'm asking as a journalist, but curious to see your take on this. How did the media deal with this change?
I think we can see that it depends on who the editors are and where their consciousness is. Are there as many women reporters as male reporters? probably not in most of the conventional newspaper and magazine world. So it was why and is why feminist media gets born. It's why we started Ms. Magazine, so there was a national publication that was controlled by women. It's why the web is now very important for women, at least women who can afford a computer, as a way of communication that women ourselves control, but it's still not equal. I sometimes wish we had a huge feminist satellite in the sky that could beam information, news, stories, fiction, poetry, because we still don't have equality in terms of who owns publications and who owns the way we communicate.
Working on that. On an international scale now, have you been following what is happening in Iran? And do you think that the recent protests are directly related to this global Me Too shift inundating social media?
Yes, I mean, the idea of not just equal rights, but especially in Iran, the safety of women, their ability to go to school. These are very, very basic rights that were largely opposed by the Taliban. Even women's ability to go out in the world without our heads covered and to go to the marketplace. All those were issues that were at stake. So it is absolutely fundamental.
I have so many questions. I'm not sure which one to pick.
Answers, if you have answers, that would be great.
I may. I don't know if they're the right ones, but maybe one question that I wanted to ask you is, have you been following the arguments within the feminists movements also? And do you see it nowadays as more united or more divided as before?
It's hard to compare, but it feels more united because I think in the beginning of the movement, there was more concern on the part of some that the fact that the presence and public organizing presence of women who were lesbians would somehow cause the movement not to succeed as much. And also the assumption was much more prevalent in those days. I remember being called by a male journalist, a friend, a colleague of many years, who, when I began to organize as a feminist, called me up and said, "Gloria, I didn't know you were a lesbian." So it was just an assumption in the beginning. I think those days are gone. I think now
let's hope
we understand that is, yeah, I think it's better understood now.
I have one last question before we head the mic to the audience. It would be, we talk a lot about women's rights, and don't get me wrong, I mean, this is wonderful, but do you also witness a change in terms of masculinity? And how do you see men being part of that change? Is that changing? Has it been changing?
Yes, there have been in earlier years more men organizing themselves as men in order to break through the gender stereotypes and gender prisons that affect them too. That they're not supposed to cry, they're not supposed to express emotion or uncertainty or whatever the prison of masculinity they are experiencing, that is very important too. Those groups and movements and books have changed the culture. I hope and believe it is now more possible for men to be considered unique and fine individuals, whether or not they are the financial support of a whole family, or whether or not they are, taking care of infants and doing other things that are not supposed to be masculine. There have been interesting efforts to support those men. Here, I remember there was a group of boys who were enthusiastic about taking care of babies, and so they went to a child care center one day a week, and they had a whole program called "Oh Boy, Babies," because babies are interesting. So, but it is still true that in many parts of society here there is a stereotype of masculinity, which men need to deal with and women need to help with.
Right, it's a trap for everyone. When I talk to younger feminists or allies, I feel like, but maybe that's because I am an optimist, but that we are on the brink of some sort of global shift, connecting the dots between racial inequalities, gender inequalities, economic inequalities, a sense of converging struggles and fights. I heard you say once that the word intersectionality was not as good as topics being intertwined. Maybe on a last word on my end, can you just explain that the quality of these issues being intertwined rather than intersectionality?
Yes, well, I mean, intersectionality is a fine word. It's just that it's a bit more academic, so it sometimes requires explanation, where intertwined is perhaps more visual and more easily understood. But the idea that each unique human being, and each of us is unique, we are each someone who could never have happened before and could never happen again, can be summed up by adjectives, is helpful in the sense that we unite to break through those adjectives, but not helpful if it continues to define us and to mitigate or confine our unique humanity. That is, I think, where we wish to go. That each human being is a unique miracle.
Thank you for that. It's a perfect answer.
And thank all of you for this amazing technological community here we have, for this feeling of intimacy across many miles and shared experience. It's very, very precious and very strengthening for me to feel this sharing across the globe. It is indeed a global movement, this feminist movement. It exists everywhere, in every country, from Africa, India, everywhere. And it's strengthening to know that, because we sometimes still are looking at institutions that exclude us, and we need to create our own global community in order to feel and to be supported. So I thank you, and I hope you will let me know literally if there is something that I can do that would be helpful.
Well, thank you, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to be part of your group, even though my back makes it more difficult to get on a plane. So I thank you very, very much for this opportunity.
You're so inspiring.
Feeling of togetherness. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
J'ai plus rien à dire, sauf merci beaucoup d'avoir été là aujourd'hui. Le festival continue pendant 13 jours, tout à travers Genève. Ce soir, au Manège de Nez, comme je l'ai dit avant, il y a plein de discussions encore qui vont arriver, plein de concerts, plein d'arts vivants. On espère vous y recroiser et merci encore d'avoir été là et d'avoir lancé ce festival avec nous.